is probably the 14th or 15th time that I'm going to talk about the IPP, but I'm also rather nervous because of so many new things. First, it's online, which I've never done before. Second, it's to a group in Ateneo de Zamboanga, and I've never been assigned to Zamboanga, so I don't know too many of you. I only know the Jesuits, actually. And also, I've always given this kind of talk to teachers, no, classroom teachers, not to formation people. And that is one of the things I had to think about in preparing for this afternoon. What about the IPP should I be sharing with people who are particularly in formation work? Add to that the fact that those who belong to the formation cluster are actually quite a disparate group. No, some are campus ministers giving retreats and recollections, but it also includes the disciplinary office and the guidance and also the outreach offices. So that's quite a whole lot to try to deal with. But I hope that you will just be able to take what I talk about and see how it might apply to your particular office or work in the high school. So, yes. Okay. Let me share with you then the PowerPoint. Just a moment, please. Okay. So Ignatian Pedagogical Paradigm, and the way I think of it in my mind really is that generally it is teaching that moves a learner. No? So it is teaching that is at the service of the learner and not just for the learner to amass information and skills, but it should move that learner into action. Perhaps the best thing to do is to also look back at what the Jesuit general, at the time that this IPP was introduced back in the 1990s, what he said about our educational apostolate. At that time, it was Father Peter Hans Kolfenbach, and he said this in the introduction to the document for the IPP. So he says that the pursuit of each student's intellectual development to the full measure of God-given talents rightly remains a prominent goal of Jesuit education. So developing our students according to their potentialities, yes, that is very much part of Jesuit education. But, he says, Jesuit education's aim, however, has never been simply to amass information or preparation for a profession, though these are important and useful to emerging Christian leaders. So you see there, right there, there's an expectation actually that our alumni become Christian leaders in the future. And that therefore our education should be beyond making them proficient for their profession. Then he continues to say, the ultimate aim of Jesuit education is rather that full growth of the person which leads to action. For me, that's a very important phrase, that full growth of the person which leads to action. So the first thing is that the learner's personhood should flourish. So the person should flourish as a person, okay? You might look back at your own experience, how you as a person flourished from childhood to through your teenage years to young adulthood, And for those of us who are beyond young adulthood to our later adulthood, we keep on flourishing, keep on growing. And that is what we want to happen to our students in our Jesuit institutions. And as you might remember, as you were developing as a person, there were also more things that you can do. You can actually have an impact on the world. So very clearly, as a child, our world just revolved around the home, mostly perhaps the neighborhood, but we cannot really contribute much to it. Later on, as we went through our teenage years and our young adulthood, then we were now part of the world and we were now active members who could change the world or also keep it as it is. So the next part is that as the person flourishes, no, the person begins to act on the world. So the learner goes into action in the world. Okay? That's why if you go back to what I subtitled the talk with, it's learning or teaching that moves a learner, no, into action. Now, let me show you perhaps it's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. Okay, I'd like to talk about these elements of Ignatian pedagogy this afternoon. They are not the only elements of Ignatian pedagogy. I've chosen these though because I think that they are the most essential and most useful, but there are others, but we cannot cover everything in one afternoon. The first one, the learning teaching dynamic, that will take quite a lot of time and it might take a lot of reading and also thinking. And it will take longer than the rest of the topics put together, no? Because that's really like a core thing. Then we go on to the other topics: scaffolding, pre-lectio, lectio, repetitio, pauca, precepta, multa, exempla, exercitatio, plurima. And then you have non multa, sed multum, and then you have tantum quantum. So this is intentional to use the Latin phrases so I can pretend to be more knowledgeable than you, but I will just explain the meanings later. Okay. So let's go to the learning teaching dynamic first. So what really distinguishes the IPP as a pedagogical paradigm is how it is rooted in the spiritual exercises. Usually when I give this talk at the beginning, I ask people how much experience you've had with the spiritual exercises. Certainly we have formation programs in our schools for faculty and staff. And so people would ordinarily have at least 3-day recollections, perhaps some would already have had 5 or 8-day retreats. And every now and then you have a 1 or 2 persons who've actually gone through the complete exercises of 30 days. Now, what does the IPP particularly take from the spiritual exercises? I would like to focus on 3. No? Again, there are more than these, but these are the 3 which I think are most essential and therefore best to take up this afternoon given our time. The first thing is that IPP takes to itself the nature of prayer as prayer is found in the spiritual exercises. Second, IPP also takes the dynamic between the director and the retreatant as the retreatant goes through the process of the exercises. And third, IPP takes from the spiritual exercises the constant call to use the faculty of reflection. So we will go deeper into these 3. What does IPP take from the spiritual exercises with respect to the nature of prayer, the dynamic between the director and the retreatant, and with respect to the constant call to reflect? Going now to the first, okay, what is the nature of prayer? And first of all, the very first thing that we have to recall is that prayer, especially in the spiritual exercises, is an interior activity. Notice how the campus ministry office would always find it difficult to choose a picture that will depict what they do. Right? It's easier for the guidance office, it's easier for the outreach, especially you have very interesting pictures. But when the campus ministry office wants to show what they do with the students, all they can show are students sitting down with eyes closed and being still, as if nothing is happening. But in fact, of course, we know all the activity is happening within the person. And that is very important to keep in mind. And also it is countercultural, because for us Filipinos, when you don't see what's happening, we think that there's nothing happening. But in fact, there has to be this countercultural attitude that we would rather also see that there seems to be nothing happening because the interiority is working or doing something. Next, in prayer in the spiritual exercises, this prayer changes the interiority of the person. So look back to your experiences of recollections and retreats, and you know that you get changed from within. No, something changes in you. The way you understand things changes. The way you perceive things and react to things changes, and hopefully even the way you make decisions also changes. So prayer in the spiritual exercises brings one to some experience of change within. The next thing is that the activity that happens in our interior selves, no, involves both our mind and our heart, the cognitive and the affective. And not only are they both involved, but they are involved simultaneously. So we see with both the mind and the heart in prayer. It is not very much of a prayer if only the mind is working. You might be theologizing but not praying. But real prayer will always involve both the mind and the heart. So that in prayer, knowing is always knowing with the heart. Now, given that, what would be the nature of learning in an IPP classroom or an IPP situation? So in the same way, in IPP, learning is an interior activity. And this is what we focus on more than trying to show that we have a very active classroom, but there is something going on within. That's what's more important. And learning in IPP should also bring about changes in the student's interiority. Because of the modes of assessment, very often what we look for are things that can be manifested externally. Can the student give the right answer? Can the student recite? Or can the student perform a role play and so on? But what is going on inside them? That is what we are more interested in when we are trying to do IPP. And just like in prayer, learning must take place in an IPP situation or classroom in such a way that it involves both the cognitive and the affective, the mind and the heart. Very often we focus on the mind because especially grade school and high school, you're threatened by this NAT and what's the other exam? NEET, no? You want to make sure that they know they do well in those exams and so on. So we might tend to focus on what they know, no? But we really want to look at both what they know and what is in their heart. So that in IPP learning, indeed, learning is also knowing with the heart. Now, I'm sure that some of you have extensive backgrounds in education. We might be able to compare this a bit with other pedagogical theories that we might know of, because we're talking about learning that is interior. Then we are taking the learner as an autonomous learner, as a learner who learns by himself or herself. We also hear from various pedagogical theories, self-determining learner. So again, the person is determining what he or she needs to learn or wants to learn. Because we are talking about a learning in which the interiority is changed, again, we hear about transformative education, which are certainly compatible with the IPP. No? And because we have learning that will involve all human faculties, not just the intellectual, but also the affectual, and then that resonates with pedagogical theories, which sometimes use these phrases: whole person education, holistic education, or multi-intelligence, and so on. So as we can see, parts of the IPP are also being articulated by these various pedagogical theories. Okay, that's our way in. If we are familiar with those pedagogical theories, then we can already grasp some parts of these, some dimension of the IPP. But I would like to focus particularly in referring to other pedagogical theories on what we call the constructivist mode. No, well, shall we admit? I'm being asked if I want to admit. Okay.
Not-meet ko na pa.
Okay. So, what we get from the first point of the nature of prayer and the nature of learning in IPP is that how we learn, what we call our epistemology, how we understand we learn, will determine how we need to be taught. Okay? Very logical lang. And how we need to be taught will then determine, what does it say there? Because actually in my screen, it's covered. How
programs and structures are designed.
Yes. Okay. So how we need to be taught will determine how programs and structures are designed. So it's first of all, the first thing that we have to be on the same page on is, do we agree on how we human beings learn? And knowing that, then we will be able to decide how we need to be taught, and then of course, how programs and structures are to be designed. Okay. And as I mentioned, in particular, it's not moving. Okay, there you go. In particular, we might take a look at constructivism, which I feel very much explains some dimension of the IPP in this point, no? So I am going to take this article from Professor George Hein, okay? Actually, he is writing about learning in museums. That's his expertise. But in one of his articles entitled The Museum and the Needs of People, he summarizes the core principles of constructivism. Now, I've sent this article, an electronic copy of it, to Brother Jeff, and perhaps Brother Jeff can later send it out to the rest. We will not read the whole article, but we will just look at four of the, I think, 12 principles that he lays out. Okay, so let's look at the first. No? Learning is an active process. I'm looking at number 1, the second paragraph on your screen. Learning is an active process in which the learner uses sensory input and constructs meaning out of it. The more traditional formulation of this idea involves the terminology of the active learner, stressing that the learner needs to do something, that learning is not the passive acceptance of knowledge which exists out there, but that learning involves the learners engaging with the world. So the learning would be stimulated by something outside, perceived through sensory output, but the actual learning happens when the person constructs meaning. Okay, and that of course takes place in the interior of the interiority of the learner. Now, the teacher or the formator does not have access to that interiority of the learner. The learner will have to do it on his or her own. Okay. Let's go now to first, let's look at the third principle that Professor Hein explains. He says, the crucial action of constructing meaning is mental. It happens in the mind. Physical actions, hands-on experience may be necessary for learning, especially for children, but it is not sufficient. We need to provide activities which engage the mind as well as the hands. So still stressing the same thing, that it is an interior act. It happens in the mind, and therefore only the learner can go through that, can do that. I like to compare it with death or falling in love. No? When we will experience death in the future, even if somebody's holding you at that moment of your death, still you will go through that process on your own. But it's also true for something more positive like falling in love. You might have your friends, you know, with whom you share all the different steps until you fell in love with a person. But that act is really just yours in the end, and we have to respect that and acknowledge that. And that's what's that happens in any moment of learning. Now let's look at the second principle. It says, people learn to learn as they learn. People learn to learn as they learn. Learning consists both of constructing meaning and constructing systems of meaning. For example, if we learn the chronology of dates of a series of historical events, we are simultaneously learning the meaning of a chronology. Each meaning we construct makes us better able to give meaning to other sensations which can fit a similar pattern. So if we have learned that we are constructing a chronology, next time we encounter something else, we might look for a chronology there. So the first phrase there, people learn to learn as they are learning. Now, this is important, especially later on when we talk about reflection, because reflection allows us to learn from the way we learn so that we can learn better in the future. Okay, so we learn to build on what and how we previously learned. I think that's why it's called constructivism. We have building blocks of knowledge, and we have to start with the most basic, and then it gets more and more complicated. And the important point here is that people construct this meaning and this learning differently. I like to give us an example, a conversation that I had with a teacher in Ateneo de Davao. He was telling me how he was never good at math. And then he said that he would always be confused by the greater than and the less than sign, okay? Until he realized he had a way of remembering. So the wider side of the greater than sign, okay, he looks at it as a mouth, okay, the greater than and the less than sign, so that what is being eaten by the mouth is the greater number. So that was his way of explaining it to himself to remember it. Then I told him that on my part, I saw it differently. I look at the 2 points of the ends of the segments. That's a greater segment as compared to the point where the two lines meet, which has a zero distance between itself. That doesn't make sense, but you know what I mean. So the one where the 2 points are with a greater distance is where you have the greater number. So these are two very different ways that we have constructed our meaning. Okay. Let's go on now we'll skip the fourth principle, but take a look at the fifth principle. Learning is a social activity. Our learning is intimately associated with our connection with other human beings, our teachers, our peers, our family, as well as casual acquaintances, including the people before us or next to us at the exhibit. We are more likely to be successful in our efforts to educate if we recognize this principle rather than try to avoid it. Much of traditional education, as Dewey pointed out, is directed towards isolating the learner from all social interaction and towards seeing education as a one-on-one relationship between the learner and the objective material to be learned. In contrast, progressive education, to continue to use Dewey's formulation, recognizes the social aspect of learning and uses conversation, interaction with others, and the application of knowledge as an integral aspect of learning. So indeed, learning is interior and therefore autonomous and individual, yet it is still social. Okay, and that's where we come in. That's our role. We are part of that social dimension of the learning. Okay, and we are perhaps that part of the social dimension which has most influence on the students in our schools. But still, the main agent of the learning, the one who goes through it all on his own, constructing meaning in his or her own way, is the student himself or herself. So that's why when we go on retreats, even if we receive points as a group, the retreat guides and retreat masters know that each one is going through his or her own unique spiritual journey, even as we begin and end the recollection or retreat all at the same time. Okay, and that is really the first thing that we take from the spiritual exercises and bring into our IPP classroom or formation context. Yeah, I forgot to bring up the lines earlier. So we focus on the interiority of the students. What differences might that make on the way that we teach or form our students? Well, we have to make choices, no? The first one is these are just examples, by the way. You can see how this focus on the interiority of the student may be relevant to your own particular task with respect to the students. But for a teacher, for example, can the student give the right answer or perform the expected action versus asking oneself what is going on in the student? How is he or she flourishing, as she goes through the learning? Okay. Another possible question that can be asked is what student knows and can do versus what the student is becoming. Is what I'm after when I am teaching or forming students just to see certain behaviors that show to me that he or she has the knowledge and skill, or am I after what the student is becoming? Another one would be choices we have to make: intellectual maturity versus emotional, which includes psychological and spiritual maturity. What are we really after? And some of the signs of emotional maturity I put there, these are just my personal examples. Do they have a sense? Do they have? Do our students have self-acceptance? Do they have resilience when they meet frustration or failures? Can they get up and move forward again? Are they developing sociability, the capability to deal with different kinds of people? Are they self-responsible? Are they socially responsible? Are they able to delay gratification? These are all parts of emotional maturity, which you would not be concerned about if your focus had only been intellectual maturity. So you see how the IPP, in looking at the interiority of the students, its concerns goes beyond what the student knows and can do. It goes beyond intellectual maturity, but looks at how the student really is flourishing as a whole person. Are you okay, guys?
Yes, Father.
Okay.
Nakamute yung microphone nila.
That's right. Okay. So let's go to the next point, which is, so the first one was the nature of prayer, and then translating that to the nature of learning in IPP context. Now, what about the dynamic between the director and the retreatant? Okay, so in fact, ironically, the retreat director does not direct. That's why we've also been avoiding that term recently, no? But the director merely co-journeys with the retreatant. So again, especially those among you who have had individual retreats, no? Remember how the director asks you what has happened in your prayer, and then how he or she provides you with new prayer material to pray on. And then the next day you see each other again, and you tell him or her what happened, and you try to make sense of it with that director, and so on. No? So you are going on your own journey, and the director is not telling you where to go. The director is trying to just help you move along in your own journey. So the director, his or her job is to propose to you the prayer material, but what that prayer material will do to you, the director does not direct, does not dictate. No? It just happens. It just happens in your prayer. And the retreatant, of course, will go through the prayer experience alone until then that he or she is able to talk to the director where they make more sense of what the retreatant has gone through in his or her prayer. So in the IPP context, the dynamic between the teacher and learner takes from that dynamic between director and retreatant. So the teacher is no longer that teacher who just tells the student what he or she should know. Rather, the teacher will also lead the learner towards the knowledge or skill that he or she is trying to convey to the student. So the teacher provides more of a learning experience which the student has to go through. And from that experience, the learner then arrives at new knowledge. Okay. And the teacher then helps the student to draw more understanding from this learning experience. So it is not at all a teacher passing on everything that he or she knows to the students, but letting the learner arrive at the knowledge. I like that phrase myself, let the learner arrive at the knowledge. Don't bring the learner to the knowledge or don't bring the knowledge to the learner, but let the learner arrive using his or her own interior resources to arrive at the knowledge. So again, this would have convergences with other pedagogical theories. Again, those autonomous learners, constructivism, eutagogy, andragogy, or self-determining learners. Autonomous learning as needing assistance would recall pedagogical theories that go by the names of social interactionism or social constructivism. Okay, and the fact that you give a lot of leeway to the learners on how he or she will arrive at the knowledge or skill or attitude might recall to us interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity. But again, I'd like to, okay, so in redefining the relationship between the teacher or formator and the student, we might have these choices before us. Am I a teacher formator who gives the answers? Or am I a teacher formator who poses questions that lead the students to their answers? And when you let students arrive at their answers, you also have to somehow respect their answers. You might give your answer for them to compare with, but actually it also means respecting them for the answers they have arrived at and not devaluing what they've arrived at because it's not the same as our answers. That's very difficult, no? Or we might continue to pose questions and show them how the answers that they have arrived at are not yet good answers. That's one way to do it. But do you give the answers or do you just pose the questions so that they arrive at the answers themselves? So this is similar. Sometimes we want to be the teacher or formator who is the wise guru, the ones that they come to all the time to ask what we want. Or do we present ourselves as being like them in search of the truth? Of course, we are older and we are wiser, but to still let them know that even as we are older and wiser, we are still looking for the truth, for new knowledge as they are. In fact, would it hurt to model to students what it is to be a lifetime learner, by sharing our own questions with them, our own questions that for which we seek answers. I do not hesitate when I am teaching and a question comes up that I cannot immediately answer to say that I haven't thought of that. I think I need to study on that. I'll get back to you next class. That's what I say. That's what I say. But it is modeling to them that all of us actually are always still in this process of learning. Or am I the teacher formator who expects to be imitated or to be obeyed? No? Again, it spells the difference between authentic respect and demanded respect. Authentic respect elicits the imitation from them. When we are the kind of teacher or formator that expects to be obeyed, then we are just demanding respect. And then as soon as you turn your back, they tell their jokes about you and all that. Okay? So these are just some of the concrete questions which might ask you, you might ask yourself, how do you redefine your relationship with the students given this paradigm of the retreat director and retreatant? Notice how maybe some of you have been in Ateneo long enough to have had several retreat directors. The best ones are those who really get across to us that they are also always still trying to learn about God and still trying to love God and to respond to God's love. All right. Now, what about the constant call to reflect? Okay, this is a very important aspect of the spiritual exercises, which is very often not evident in the shorter forms of experiencing the exercises, like in the recollection or a 3-day retreat, and perhaps even in the 5-day retreat, there would hardly be any repetition being required, no? Because there's such a short time for the retreat. But in fact, in the full-blown version of the spiritual exercises, Ignatius asks the retreatant to keep on going back to what he has already prayed on, and also to go back at what happened in prayer. The examen, surely you've heard of the consciousness examen. The examen is definitely, a prayer that comes from the spiritual exercises. So the call to reflect, now to step back and look at how one responded to the prayer experience. That is actually what the director might ask a retreatant. So when you were contemplating on the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus, okay? So you went through that prayer period. What was going on inside you? What were attractions and repulsions? What were consolations and desolations? Let me define for you again what consolation and desolation mean in the spiritual exercises. Consolation does not mean happy, and desolation does not mean sad. Consolation in the spiritual exercises means a feeling of closeness, of union with God. Desolation means, and only means, a feeling of being distanced or separated from God. Okay. So when did you feel close to God? That's a consolation moment. And when did you feel far from God? That's a desolation moment. Okay. So perhaps if let's say I I competed in some contest, and I did all that I could to prepare for the contest, but in the end, someone was better than me. So I'm sad because I did not win. But in my heart, I knew I did all that I could, and that this other person just was really better than me. And I actually was impressed by what he did, by how he performed, and I actually admired him. That moment may have been sad in the sense that I lost in the contest, but there is that peace inside me that I did all that I could to prepare for the contest, and that's how far I got, and that I can also appreciate how good the winner was, really, how better he was than me. So there is consolation there, despite the sadness. So consolations, the nearness to God can happen even in a sad event. The same way, a desolation can happen even in a happy event. You can feel far from God even when, like when let's say, uh, when we sometimes fall into the temptation of making fun of somebody, no, maybe bullying, we're having fun, but then deep inside we feel a certain pang of guilt. We feel distance from God because we know that we are uh, putting down a person. So there is desolation even if you're at the moment laughing at that person. Okay, so that is very crucial to discernment of spirits, and that is something that we learn, okay, as we continue to do reflection within the spiritual exercises. Now, we do this, we look at what our attractions and repulsions are and what our moments of consolations and desolations are in a prayer, so that we know where God is leading us. God is leading us through those moments of consolation, and God is leading us away from something through those moments of desolation. That's the basic thing. And in looking back, reflecting on our prayer experiences, or repeating a prayer material in the retreat, we appropriate the meaning and implications of the things that we are coming to understand. No? So here's when the understanding moves to decision making, which eventually will move to action. And that happens because we give it time to happen when we give the time to reflect. And so that new understanding develops a new way of seeing things, of decision making, and then moves into action. So that completes it. We move into action. Now, in the IPP context, whether in formation or in an academic classroom, okay, there is also this constant call to reflect, and hopefully the students will learn pretty much what they would have learned within a retreat. That is to identify the attractions and repulsions, the consolation moments and desolation moments in their experiences, whether it's a formation program activity or in a classroom setting. And in so doing, begin to see where the student is, where he or she is being drawn to by God, or sometimes where God is leading them away from. And the, the teachers or formators are there to help them appropriate the meaning and implications of the things that they understand. And hopefully, of course, this translates, all of this will translate to some kind of action. Are you okay, you guys? I know this is a medyo heavy content part na to. Okay, again, even that, which seems to be very Ignatian and very much in the spiritual exercises, would still resonate with some other pedagogical theories that you might be familiar with. For example, this review of or reflection on learning experience is found in pedagogy. It's found in metacognitive learning theories and some sub-schools of constructivism. Also, connecting one knowledge area to another, of course, that recalls to us inter and multidisciplinarity. And again, looking at the effect on the learner's life as a whole brings back theories like holistic education, whole person education, and transformative education. So I'm just bringing back this slide. So remember, how we learn determines how we need to be taught and how programs and structures are to be designed. Okay. In particular, I would want to focus for a moment on andragogy and together with this eutagogy. So andragogy was a term that started, I think, in the early 70s, 1970s, so that's already half a century ago. But it tried to differentiate itself from pedagogy. So because peda comes from the word pedia, so child. So that's like how to teach a child. No, andragogy was trying to emphasize that there's a different kind of pedagogy involved when you are dealing with adults. So andra from andro, which is man. Sorry, it's a sexist word, but for the adult and not for the child. What kind of learning is supposed to happen? And Knowles, who was the one who introduced this first, at least published a book about it first, says it is a process in which individuals take the initiative with or without the help of others in diagnosing their learning needs, in formulating learning goals, in identifying human and material resources for learning, in choosing and implementing appropriate learning strategies, and evaluating learning outcomes. In other words, the teacher's role then would be more of helping the student learn how to learn. But the student himself or herself will do the learning that he or she has determined he needs or wants, and will choose how he or she will do the learning. Now, eutagogy is a later development. This time, euta means self, no? And this is a definition. Jeff, can you please read that? Because again, it's covered here. Hindi ko memorized yan eh. As in
andragogical approach in eutagogy, the instructor also facilitates the learning process by providing guidance and resources, but fully relinquishes ownership of the learning path and process to the learner, who negotiates learning and determines what will be learned and how it will be learned.
So it almost sounds like eutagogy, and it may not be clear in this definition how it's different from andragogy. I'm sorry, I meant to say eutagogy from this definition sounds like andragogy, and it's not clear how it's different. Let me show you this graph then. So this would be more of andragogy. No? The student faces a problem, and the student looks for ways to learn something so that he goes into action to learning and finding out what he should do to solve the problem. And then he ends up with an output, no, the solution to the problem. And having arrived at an output and having tried to solve the problem, then it goes back to identifying other problems and then looking for solutions again, action, and then taking that action so that you have the solution again. So that's andragogy. Okay, so the person determines what he needs or wants to learn, looks for it himself, and then it has a result which brings up new questions or problems. So it's an ongoing loop of learning. So lifelong talaga, no? Now, eutagogy will have a second loop. This second loop looks at the person learning. So the person himself, okay, apart from doing what he would do under the first theory, andragogy, also looks at his or her own beliefs and actions. He looks at her own and his or his own way of learning things. So it's not just the problem out there that the person is trying to solve that he begins to understand. The eutagogical learner also learns more and more how he or she learns. Okay, so those are, then you have two loops going on instead of just one. Now that double loop, that simultaneous learning of the material to be learned and of learning about oneself definitely is part of IPP. So I'm referring to these theories, which of course came much later than the IPP or the Ignatian pedagogy because they help us understand Ignatian pedagogy better. No? They have articulated things. By the way, if we had been able to watch the video, then we would have been told that actually the IPP is a very late version, very recent version of what was started in 1599 called the Ratio Studiorum. That was the teacher's guide for the Jesuit colleges at that time. No? But the Ratio Studiorum did talk about how the teaching should be done, and it also talked about what should be taught. Now with IPP, we are not told what to teach, but it is still telling us how to do it. So using the reflexive powers constantly, that's the third thing that we are focusing on as an element that IPP takes from the spiritual exercises and applies to the classroom or formation setting. And I just want to emphasize here that the reflexive activity of the students are meant to be present at very different levels. In the first one, so the very process that we are trying to teach something to the students should be a process in which students learn by reflecting on some experience, how they arrive at the new learning or understanding. Okay. But again, reflexive powers are employed by the students when the students try to learn how he or she learns. Okay, eutagogy yan. But it goes on. Reflective powers is also a means, is also employed when we try to teach our students how to affirm or deny the truth of something that he or she has been told or has read or has experienced. And the reflexive powers are again still being used in the process of learning how to discern. So actually it's the big mistake that that was made when they first introduced IPP to us in the 1990s, 94, 95, was that it seemed like reflection was just one step of the IPP. But actually reflection pervades many parts and dimensions of an IPP learning process. So this is just to show you that reflection goes on, and some of these things happen all at the same time. Okay. So these were the three things that we drew out of this discussion. That prayer is an interior act, focuses us on the interiority of the student, that looking at the relationship between the director and the retreatant invites us to redefine our relationship with our students, and the repeated call for reflection in various forms in the spiritual exercises also tell us to bring our students to situations where they are constantly using their reflective powers in very different ways at different levels. So just a quotation I found just to emphasize that we focus on the interiority, not on what is more often what we're after, what we can see and what we can measure. The surface of things gives enjoyment, but interiority gives life. Okay. Now, when the IPP was introduced to us back in 94, 95, and for the following years, there was this acronym. Some say SERAE, some say SERE. I'm not sure. What do you use in Zamboanga, Jeff?
Father, sorry?
What do you use? The CERAE, context, experience, reflection, action, evaluation. How do you call this in Zamboanga? Is it SERAE or SERE?
Actually, Father, for di na usually ginagamit, Father.
Hindi na ginagamit.
Actually, sa amin, Father, our teachers would refer it to SERI. We also use it for our students.
Okay, so SERE ang familiar. Okay. All right, so just reviewing this because it is still very much part of the IPP. When we look at the context of learning, we are looking at different levels again. That's why if you notice on the heading, I don't call it 5 steps, I erased steps, I call it dimensions. Because these are things that we have to keep on, like what I've already explained on with regard to reflection. It's at different levels. It's not just a sequential step-by-step process. No? So for example, in the context, we are looking at different contexts all at the same time. The learner's world, what is the personal history of the students and even of individual students in that classroom? What are their life circumstances? No? What are their characteristics at the moment? If they're like in grade 7, do they even have the physiological capabilities to handle materials that we are giving to them? For example, this might be meaningful to those who are in the outreach programs. You want to teach them social justice, but can they already conceptualize social justice at grade 7? I mean, maybe not. I don't know the answer. But we might be talking about social justice, but they're not even capable of that yet. Maybe they can already understand commutative justice, right? But we have to consider what they are ready for, okay? And then the capabilities of the students and their limitations. Notice how one interesting fact I've come across over the past few years is how that part of the brain of the human person, that part of the brain that develops our sense of right and wrong, actually gets fully developed only when we are already 25 years old. Now, does that reality have any impact on how you will design your formation programs? How does that affect the procedures in, let's say, for the disciplinary office? Do you actually hold a student as responsible for a wrong act as you would a 30-year-old? So that has implications on how you will discipline the students. No? And that might actually be telling us that punitive measures in disciplinary procedures may have to be reviewed. Are we doing what really the students need at that age that they are in? But not only do we consider the context of the student, but we also consider the context in the sense of the school environment itself. And especially now with this sudden change to online learning and teaching, that changes the context entirely, okay? And then the wider context, the wider world, our country, and even the world community. So the context, are there things that we need to be addressing because of what's going on in the country or because of what's going on in the world? Next, the importance of letting the students experience. No? Now, the students, as they go through the experience, will make meaning of it, given what they previously have known. No? They will look at the experience and or the new information, and they will be able to draw some new knowledge from it. So in other words, giving the information to them or giving them the attitudes that they should have is not going to, it's not the best way to do that, no? For them to acquire those knowledge or attitudes or values. It is allowing them to go through experience so that they themselves, by an interior act of their own, will embrace those values for themselves. Well, when I give this talk in a longer span of time, I give this example. This is not a formation example, but an academic example. I actually just did this to 3 scholastics in Loyola House last week. I make them read these sonnets, and I make them compare and contrast, no? What they notice, what are similar between the two. And then slowly, of course, they will start saying that they have the same number of lines, the same rhythm, the same rhyme scheme, and so on. So slowly they are actually, by reading the 2 sonnets and looking at it materially, they are slowly describing the characteristics of a sonnet. I did not start the class with, this is what a sonnet is. There are 14 lines, and you have a rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. No, I make them look at it, read 2 of them, and they begin to draw their own observations on what's similar. And in so doing, they are beginning to describe the characteristics of this kind of sonnet. Then eventually I would tell them, although they might have already guessed that these sonnets are from Shakespeare, so they're called Shakespearean sonnets. Okay, and then I give them a 3rd sonnet. This the one on the right. What guile is this? That those her golden tresses she doth attire under a net of gold. I will make them compare the two now, and they will begin to see similarities, but also differences. So they might say, well, there are still 14 lines, but the rhyme scheme from A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G has become A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C, D, C, D, and so on. So they're going to see the differences of these two sonnets. Actually, there's even an argument in the sonnet, if there's more time, how the idea or argument is developed can be observed also. So they're beginning to describe how this Shakespearean sonnet on the left is different from this third sonnet. And it is only later that I tell them that, well, the third sonnet is from Spenser. And now you can begin to see how they are both called sonnets, and yet there are differences. But there seem to be certain characteristics that remain the same, even if you have a Shakespearean sonnet or one from Spenser. And I also asked the question, if the sonnets from Shakespeare are called Shakespearean sonnets, what might the sonnets of Spenser be called? And of course, they always answer Spenserian, and that's correct. So notice how I make them arrive at the knowledge of what a sonnet is and how sonnets may be different from each other without ever telling them what a sonnet is. But I pose the question or the activity which helps them arrive at it. That's from Amoretti, Edmund Spenser. So you might notice how that in that example of, let's say, teaching the sonnets, I was using more of an inductive method. I gave them two concrete specific examples, and they began to make conclusions about them, okay, making a generalized rule that, oh, a sonnet has 14 lines, a sonnet has a rhyme, a sonnet has a rhythm, and so on. As opposed to when we are trying to catch up with our syllabi, we will use deductive method. We'll just give them all the answers. So these are the characteristics of sonnet. So basically, you give that back to me during the exam. And how that works with the next choices before us. Do we give students an experiential and situational kind of learning experience? Or do we start off with the conceptual and theoretical? We are not saying that we never go deductive, but when we do have the chance to go inductive, do we prefer it? We are also not saying that we should never go to the level of concept and theory. Of course not, we should actually, but can we get there first by experiential and situational means? Then we draw out things from the concrete examples to the more generalized, which then are conceptual and theoretical. But then what you have your students doing is that they are arriving at the knowledge on their own. But you are providing the situation that will allow them to arrive there. And sometimes you make a mistake. So the third level, of course, the third dimension is reflection, but I've talked about that a lot, so I think I will skip this already. And then the fourth, well, in the example of the sonnets, I might ask them, so how did you figure out what the characteristics of the sonnets are? What did you do? And they might say, well, we compared and contrasted the first two and then the second with the third. So, okay, so now you know that comparing and contrasting is one way to arrive at new knowledge. And then they were generalizing from the specific experience of the first and the second Shakespearean sonnets. They were generally templating, making a template that a sonnet must have 14 lines, must have this rhyme, and so on. So those are the mental activities that they did which allowed them to arrive at new knowledge. So making them aware of that would then prepare them to keep on learning when they are faced with something else. No? And on the personal level, if I ask them to reflect, on their experience of learning about the sonnets, they might say, well, I can actually notice on my own the defining characteristics of a sonnet if I just compare and contrast. I don't have to go and get it from Google, which is what their usual reaction is, okay, when you give them an assignment. Or somebody might say, well, the rhymes also help me remember things. So once again, that is something that allows them, that will assist them in their future learning. All right. And then the fourth dimension is action. So, well, this one applies to the academic situation when you want them to be able to exhibit their knowledge and skill. Okay, so they have to show that. But more importantly, the reflection should also lead to the students' decision making and action in the world. I think I've explained that enough. So an example of the correct action on the level of the academic target, I might ask them, okay, so identify the characteristics of other sonnets. I might give them still another kind of sonnet and they can analyze it. Or they can also learn from their experience that in reading the sonnets themselves, instead of reading from Google what others have said about them, they have a more concrete and solid grasp of what sonnets are. Now, this is what happens when there is a continuing reflection. This is from the original document of the IPP from 1993. This is what's expected to happen. Let's just read this. In time, the meanings, attitudes, values, which have been interiorized, made part of the person, impel the student to act, to do something consistent with this new conviction. If the meaning was positive, then the student will likely seek to enhance those conditions or circumstances in which the original experience took place. For example, if the goal of physical education has been achieved, the student will be inclined to undertake some regular sport in his free time. I just paused because I realized my PE teachers did not succeed. I don't indulge in sports at all. If she has acquired a taste for history or literature, she may resolve to make time for reading. Well, okay, so my English teachers did a good job. If he finds it worthwhile to help his companions in their studies, he may volunteer to collaborate in some remedial program. If he or she appreciates better the needs of the poor after service experiences, this might influence his or her career choice or move the student to volunteer to work for the poor. If the meaning was negative, then the student, sorry, I forgot about this. Where am I? If the meaning was negative, then the student will likely seek to adjust, change, diminish, or avoid conditions and circumstances in which the original experience took place. So here we're talking about consolation and desolation moments, actually, where they experience consolation, that deeper kind of joy, like in doing service for the poor or in doing their schoolwork on time. Then they are moved to keep on doing the same thing. Where they experience desolation, like when they did not do the requirements for a class or something, then they are moved to adjust or change themselves or to avoid the conditions and circumstances where that desolation moment happens. For example, if the student now appreciates the reasons for his or her lack of success in schoolwork, the student may decide to improve study habits in order to avoid repeated failure. So notice how this requires, for this to happen, this requires the student to actually be listening to what's going on within him or her. What repulsions and attractions are there? What consolations and desolations are there? Then finally, the fifth dimension of the IPP is the evaluation. And basically, it's again like reflection, a looking back. Again, evaluation must take place at different levels. And of course, with respect to the classroom situation, you have evaluation in terms of summative assessments, but there must also be evaluation of the students of themselves, of how they are flourishing as persons. So I might give us an evaluation, give the students a sonnet specimen, and ask them to identify its defining characteristics. Or evaluation of, on the other level, ask students to write a reflection paper or an evaluation of what they gained from the course personally. So, of course, in the formation programs, the letter B comes more naturally than it does in the academic classroom. I'm going to just, I don't think we need to repeat all that. But basically, those five, context, experience, reflection, action, evaluation, they are not steps, but they are dimensions that ought to be kept in mind all throughout the process of teaching and learning, or in the process of forming and transformation. All right, so that ends that very long part, just the first part. But as I said, the next are very short, 1 or 2 slides each, okay? But they are still very key elements of Ignatian pedagogy. The first one is about scaffolding, that you build up. This is consistent with the point I was trying to emphasize when I discussed constructivism. You build up the knowledge of the person, the basic stuff first, going to the more complicated stuff. So this goes back to the study plan in the 16th century, to a document that goes back to 1556. So though you have those 3 steps, those are the first 3 steps. No, first the person has to converse, read, and write in elementary Latin. Then you build on that. Formal Latin and grammar are learned, and then you build on that. Rhetoric, poetry, history are then learned for formal writing and speaking. And from that, the more specialized learning happens. This is the Jesuit University back then. First, the logic, physics, metaphysics, moral science, and mathematics are learned. And then what they call the professional training at that time, it's just either theology, law, or medicine. Okay, and there are assigned faculty for each level. The first step actually is expected to have happened somewhere else, but in the university you have the Faculty of Languages teaching formal Latin, and then the formal writing and speaking in Latin. And then you have the Faculty of Arts. So logic, physics, metaphysics, moral science, and mathematics are there in Faculty of Arts. And then finally, for the professional level, you have the specific faculty, Faculty of Theology, Faculty of Law, or Faculty of Medicine. But the basic idea here is that you build on what was already built, okay? And that means also you don't go to the next step before the first step is mastered. Now that's a big problem here in our country because we are under the DepEd or the CHED, which is dictating on us how much and what we should have taught by the end of each year. And we are also under pressure that to teach all of that, okay? So what happens is we might be short-circuiting the learning process of our students. What the point here is that you must always begin where the students are and not where they actually are and not where you expect them to be at their age. There's a big difference in that. Where are they really and where should, and as opposed to what we would have thought would be their level at the moment. When in Ateneo de Naga, it's only recently that they had a grade school introduced. So the junior high school where I was principal, our students came from all different schools, not Ateneo. No, there was no Ateneo grade school for a long while. So the students come with very varied preparations for high school. And when we were reviewing and we were revising the math entrance exam, the math teachers, math department first gave me a draft where they said they were measuring what the students knew from the expectations of the grade 6 math curriculum. Then I asked them, but in your experience, are all of our grade 7 students already proficient in grade 5 math competencies? And then they said, no, Father. Okay, so then maybe our exam should also look first if they also know the grade 5 competencies. So they took away the first draft with them, they redid it, and when they came back, they said, Father, we went back to grade 4. Because that's the reality. That's the reality. Some students were in grade 4. There were those who were grade 6, but there's not a few who were still in grade 4 and grade 5. So their math classes had to be clustered so that those who needed to go back to grade 4 will go back to grade 4 in the beginning of their grade 7. And then they said, Father, what will happen? They might fall behind and, they might not finish the grade 7 material if we start with grade 4 or grade 5. Well, we're going to keep them together. But I assure you that if you bring them to mastery of grade 4 and grade 5 competencies, the grade 6 and the grade 7 they will go through much more quickly. So that by the time they're in grade 9, they will be at par with the others and in time for the NAT exams. So, but that took a lot of daring. They were very hesitant to do that because they're, especially there in Naga, the DepEd is very strong. So, and some parents of ours are actually in DepEd, are employees of DepEd. So they might wonder, why are they still teaching this? This is grade 5 stuff. No? But really, I think the experience, I'm just hoping that they continued it after that. the students, then by the time they came to grade 7 material, were much better prepared for the grade 7 material and so on. But it's also true for formation. How much of all this man for others, man and women for others, social justice, how much of that can they really take at grade 7? What are they prepared for? Can they even conceptualize social justice? That's my question. And if not, what is it that you need to convey to them? I was also focusing a lot on the guidance office. I said, let's really work on their self-acceptance at grade 7. Okay? Because that's the most crucial thing they need at the moment. Especially they came from these different schools and then they come together here. It's such a big school. It's very threatening. You know, the Ateneo, of course, has a high prestige and there's a lot of insecurity going on. And that is blocking their development as persons and also academically. And so even if you just focus almost exclusively on appreciating oneself, one's personal history, one's unique gifts, and accepting one's weaknesses, even one's defects, and so on, and learning how to accept oneself and each other, that is a very important ground on which you can build other important things in grade 8, 9, and 10. But you need to build that ground of self-acceptance in grade 7 first. This is an example. You don't have to accept what I say. But there is still that idea of scaffolding. No? Do not be overly ambitious that they should already reach this or that kind of sense of being men and women for others. Be realistic, because they can just pretend. Oh, we know that they want us to talk about others and so on, the poor. So we will talk about that, but it's not real. All right. So it's consistent with these annotations that we find in the this whole idea that we find in the spiritual exercises. Okay, sorry, Bok, I see you. Can you read that because it's covered, the 18th annotation?
The spiritual exercises have to be adapted to the dispositions of the persons who wish to receive them, that is, to their age, education, or ability, in order not to give to one who is uneducated or of little intelligence things he cannot easily bear and profit by.
Okay, so very clearly, Ignatius was very aware that people are not the same. We are equal in dignity, but we are not the same. Can you continue, please? Bob?
So too should he who is giving the exercises observe that he who is receiving them has little ability or little natural capacity, from whom not much fruit is to be hoped. It is more expedient to give him some of these easy exercises until he confesses his sins. Then let him be given some examines of conscience and some method for going to confession oftener than what was his custom, in order to preserve what he has gained, but let him not go on into the matter of the election or into any other exercises that are outside the first week, and there is not time for everything.
Okay, so that may sound harsh and very judgmental of Ignatius, but maybe that's the way it should be. Give it to them only if they're ready for them. All right, that's done. And then next one is what you call pre-lecture, lecture, repetitio. So those are the 3 steps of a lesson. Lecture comes from the word like lector in the mass, diba? Reading, because back in the 16th century, what happened in the lecture halls is that the professor comes in and literally reads from a prepared speech, and that's all that happens. That's why that was the lecture, the actual reading. Now, we call pre-lecture is the preparation for the lecture, and then repetitio is to going back to what was read in the pre-lecture and the lecture. Now, in the classroom situation, a pre-lecture ordinarily would involve some reading and basically, read the chapter or read the story and so on. And then with that reading, of course, which will be checked if they did that with a quiz or something the next day, that is a preparation for the actual lecture, which will happen with the professor. Now, information, this would mean giving the students ways of disposing themselves to the experience they are about to have, okay? This is not to be confused with motivational activity, which is just meant to arouse interest, but it should already prepare them interiorly of what is going to happen. I remember when I was in high school and we had a 7-day immersion program, the immersion itself in the community was 7 days. But 2 days before that, we were already together in the dorm and we were going through a pre-immersion program. So that's the pre-lecture. We do not just dump them into the experience without preparing them for it, especially if it's a difficult experience they're about to take. It might be exposing them to an entirely different culture that needs a lot of preparation. And then the actual experience itself, of course, as we have been saying, should take into consideration the context of the students. Is it appropriate to their age, appropriate to their academic level, appropriate to their even their emotional resources at the moment, or perhaps even their financial resources at the moment. So the appropriateness of the experience should be checked in giving the lecture. So information, the same criteria of age appropriate and academic level appropriate activities should be followed. This should allow the students to experience something from which they will be able to draw what is to be learned, and preferably they will come to this understanding by reflection or a metacognitive procedure. But it doesn't stop there. This is where the obsessive compulsiveness of Ignatius perhaps manifests itself. There has to be repetitio, a repetition of the lesson, okay, which is the only way that mastery will be achieved. So information, opportunities for students to continue to practice what they had gained from their formation should be provided. Okay. I remember for us Daysers, the Days with the Lord, after we go to the Days with the Lord ourselves, then we are invited to participate in the next ones as those who are serving the new participants. So there is a continuation of the experience, and that really deepens the whatever attitudes and values that we had gained from the start. So pre-lecture, lecture repetitio, preparation, disposition is important, appropriateness of the experience itself, but it does not stop there. There must be repetition. Now the next one, the next principle, pauca precepta, multa exempla and exercitatio plurima or plurissima exercitatio is probably more applicable to the academic classroom than the formation programs, okay? But still, uh, it advises, this advice is you give the students few principles at a time. So bawal ang cramming. The last 5 lessons in the syllabus you cram in the last week of class. Who has not done that? Few principles at a time, and then for every principle, give many examples and very many or numberless exercises. This is what can bring the students to a level of mastery. Few principles at a time, then many examples, and then numberless exercises. I think in the formation context, the first two are easily still applicable. Even guidance programs, give them one thing at a time, not too many, and give them examples to learn from. Maybe there's no such thing as numberless exercises for many of the formation program, for many of the formation programs. But instead of mastery, it's not so much mastery that you are looking for in the formation program, but internalization. That is what you are looking for in formation, that it is truly internalized. No? Because everyone in the classroom keeps quiet, right? Because they're threatened. If they're not quiet, they can get punished. But it's the value of keeping quiet and letting the teacher talk or letting a classmate talk internalized so that they embrace that value themselves. That, I think, is how IPP applies to formation particularly. That is what you are targeting, the internalization of those values. They can actually master the, I introduced the consciousness examen in Ateneo de Naga. So some teachers, I encourage them, the teachers, either to lead the students themselves in their own words, or they can also use videos. So they do it every afternoon, the last 7-8 minutes of class. And some teachers use the same video all the time. So the students actually had begun to memorize the script of the video, which I'm sure will have its benefit later on. But they may have mastered it, but the next thing is it really sinking in? That's the other thing that we have to look at. But it is, I think, also, there is some internalization that might have happened just by the mere fact that they can repeat the whole script on their own. All right. As I told you, these are quick and they're shorter than the first part altogether. Non multa sed multum, I think, is something that's very familiar to us, right? Hindi pala makasagot. Okay. So not many, but much. So again, I'm trying to, I was trying to go back to this when I was trying to convince the faculty in Ateneo de Naga Junior High School to start where the students are. No, it's not how much of the syllabus that we teach them that matters, it's how much that they get. So, and if you have to go more slowly because they are absorbing it more slowly, then let it be. But at least what they learn, they really know. Okay? So it does not, of course, refer to the pauca precepta. You must give many examples and many exercises. But it refers to the transferable skills and competencies in academics. Okay? What are the key skills? One of the problems when a certain woman from UP was employed by the Department of Education under Brother Armin Luistro, she changed what was already a sufficient curriculum and filled it up with so many things so that in the end, the new K+12 curriculum is even more crowded than it was when it was K+10. I will not mention that her name is Dina Ocampo. But that's it. Too much, and then when you get them in college, they know nothing. They were given a lot, but they know nothing. But for formation, also, you might be giving too much. What really are the key insights and attitudes, that you really want them to absorb per year, perhaps? And actually, even if you leave it at that, because they really internalize that, they will actually flourish as persons later on. The natural process of life will draw out some more from them. For example, when I was in Ateneo de Naga, one of the things I realized was that the students, and in fact a few teachers, did not have a sense of what delayed gratification is. That's DNG, not Dolce et Gabbana. It's delayed gratification. Okay. So I told them one Monday morning when we have the assembly about the story that it's not just a story, it's a real experiment about the marshmallow. This was back in the 70s, I think. Basta I heard it when I was in college pa. Children were brought into a room one by one, and there was a bowl of marshmallow in front of them. And then the people running the experiment would tell the child, don't eat any of the marshmallows until I tell you to later. Then the person leaves the room. And then they observe the child and see if the child will be able to really control himself or herself or not. So of course, there were children who were able to control themselves and there were children who did not. And then it was a long-term study. So many years later, when the children had become adults, they tried to trace how those children fared in life. And those who were able to delay gratification were found to be in much better places in life. They were more accomplished, they have more achievements, and so on. Okay, so I really thought that in my experience with the kids that in Ateneo de Naga, that they did not have this concept of delaying gratification. And they really found it, eventually I got feedback, and they really found it interesting. Actually, even some of the teachers reacted, Father, we never knew that, and things like that. No? So naming it was important, and I think at least some of the students will really benefit from it. One of the things I'm noticing now among young people, well, this time it's the college, no, that I think they are experiencing a lot of cognitive dissonance. And perhaps a good formation program will address this experience. How does one deal with experiences of cognitive dissonance? I won't explain that more. I'll leave it to you to look up what that means. Okay. But there are key insights and attitudes, and to focus on them and make sure that they are truly internalized. I think that's the thing that the formation programs should really focus on. And then finally, tantum quantum, but that's not yet finally. Actually, I have something else. Tantum quantum, which might be familiar enough. I wonder if Father Carol has been using that. It has nothing to do with physics. It means insofar as or in as much as. Okay. It is found in the, what do you call this? The principle, what is this? Well, principle and foundation. Okay, the very first part of the spiritual exercises it says, we are to use them, all the gifts we have, all the created things that we have, in so far as tantum quantum, they lead us to our last end, and we need to be rid of them insofar as they hinder us in the pursuit of the end for which we are created. So this means that we need to include, okay, whatever helps, and we need to remove what does not help. So I was talking to a philosophy teacher in Naga, and he said that he asked his students to make a video of as a kind of requirement, no? And he was very happy about it because the students were excited about it. But really, I said, what all the time that they use up to make the video, where does that go? To what purpose does that go? Really? Does it really help you bring them to the understandings that you wanted to convey to them? You're not a film class, you're not a media class, you're a philosophy class. Now, do they really get to the? I was asking him, and actually he was saying that yes, it does. So, well, okay, but be ready to remove just as you are ready to include. Now, specific question to this group, since you are a group of formation people. Does the IPP mean something unique to formation? This is something I just thought about since last Friday or soon after Brother Jeff asked me to prepare for this talk. And I don't know if he will agree with this or if the other Jesuits will. But there are two things which I think are unique to formation if you want to do IPP. The first thing is about the discernment of spirits. I think that a Jesuit institution, perhaps more towards the grade 9, grade 10, and the senior high, maybe not so much for elementary, definitely, but we should be sharing with our students the discernment of spirits. And we as teachers and staff and personnel of the school should become well-versed in it and experts in it so that we can convey it to our students. I'm talking about the Ignatian discernment of spirits, and in this version of the translation of the exercises, you will see there, it's one whole section after the 4th week, no? For some, again, I cannot see, but it's actually not long. The text is not long. This book has the original literal translation and the more modern translation. And actually the discernment of spirit guidelines take up basically 6 or 7 pages only. This is the first page of the rules. So to your left, no, you see that it's written differently compared to the one on the right. The left is a literal translation of what Ignatius wrote. To the right is already a rendering of the same, but in more modern contemporary writing. So this is the first page, and you might see at the bottom of the right page, spiritual consolation is described. Now this is the next page, and then on the right column again, you have, after the definition of spiritual consolation, spiritual desolation. So it's actually just about 6 pages of this, but there's a lot more to it than what's said there. And perhaps if ever, that is something that we need to be able to share with our students and it will definitely involve all the offices under the formation cluster, not just the campus ministry, but the guidance, definitely the disciplinary office, and definitely the outreach office. Okay, and anything else other than the discernment of spirits? I think the IPP, if we are to be faithful to it, we will then, just my last answer, we would really get them to understand and do the consciousness examen. I won't explain that much anymore. I think many are actually familiar with it, but are we doing it? Okay, so yes. Now, these are the last two slides. These are questions. The first one, this one is more for the academic classroom. To check myself if I am doing IPP, I ask these questions to myself. This is academic classroom. Am I letting my students arrive at the information or the skill instead of telling them or giving it to them? Am I giving them enough leads, basic information to get to the understanding or skill? Because I might also not giving sufficiently. Is my lesson where they are? Like, do I follow where they are instead of what the syllabus says, despite falling behind or perhaps exceeding the syllabus? And do I not move on until they have reached mastery? The scaffolding, remember? And do I make them learn about how they learn? Because that's how they become lifelong learners. Do my lessons eventually let them flourish as persons? Or are they just well-informed, skillful professionals? What kind of persons do they become? Do my lessons eventually require decision and action in the world? Do I move them towards that challenge? And do I actually develop in them the habit of reflection? So I find that if I just also ask myself, if I look at one, let's say a chunk of unit plan, of lesson plans, am I doing this? It alerts me to things that I need to correct or check on. Now, yesterday I made a set of questions for formation people, and it's almost the same, but I have a +1. So the same thing, am I letting them arrive at their own understanding? Am I giving them enough leads, basic information to get to the understanding? Does the program or procedure, I put procedure here because I was thinking of the disciplinary office in particular. You have your disciplinary procedures. Does the procedure meet the students where they are? Or do you make them more responsible for something that as children they cannot be responsible for? I mean, that's one possibility. You could also be making them less responsible for something they should already be responsible for. It's the other way around. Do I not move on until they have reached internalization, replacing the word mastery? Do I make them learn about how they learn? That's still the same. Does the program or procedure eventually let them flourish as persons? Again, because I had a lot of experience with the disciplinary office, it can happen that we destroy the student, instead of building him up. So, but also the guidance office, very important for you to consider this. And then does the program procedure eventually require decision and action in the world? Do I develop in them the habit of reflection? The same. And the +1 is this. Does the program develop in them the habit of Ignatian discernment? I think that's the role. A school is not only about academics, it's about formation. That's why you have, 2 VPs or 2 assistant principals, because these two are supposed to work together. And if there's any role of the formation that is really it's within its area of responsibility is that habit of discernment. We really don't expect the academic personnel to teach that. That really falls into your area of responsibility. And I think that is the end, finally. Sorry it took so long.